Welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Cullinane. Welcome back to the show. Today's episode is a little bit different. We have a co-host. Michael Connally is joining us. I'm very excited to introduce him. He's currently a PhD student at Loyola University studying history and public history. He's actually working on a comparative history of the Magdalen laundries in Canada and Ireland and elsewhere. Really interesting research, and his resume is as interesting. He has an MA from the University of Calgary, which leads me to say that he's also Canadian, and he's also a former politician. Indeed, he's one of the youngest politicians to be elected to Alberta's Legislative Assembly. All of this is to say that Michael is a remarkable friend and colleague, and he's going to be a wonderful co-host, and I'm leaving it to him now. Cue the intro music.
Hello, and welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your special co-host for the summer and likely part of the fall, Michael R.D. Connally. Firstly, I want to thank the Society for the Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era for working with Michael Cullinane and myself to create and sponsor this position. The Society is the primary professional association for historians of the era, and I'm sincerely grateful to be the graduate student representative for the Society. In addition to events and opportunities for scholars and emerging scholars, Shigate publishes an exceptional journal called the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. If you like this show, you'll love the journal, and you might want to consider joining the Society, particularly if you are a graduate student or an undergraduate student. You can find out more on shigate.org. Nothing is more pervasive in American public history than the Civil War and the Lost Cause narrative, an ideological movement that took root, in the words of historian David Blight, in a Southern culture of the psychological trauma of defeat, racial violence, and abiding sentimentalism. The Lost Cause served the aims of reconciliation with the white North and white Southern partisans following the Civil War. One of the most pervasive embodiments of the Lost Cause can be found in the subject of today's Roundtable, D.W. Griffith's movie, The Birth of a Nation. Originally released in 1915 and based on Thomas Dixon Jr.'s 1905 novel, The Klansman, The Birth of a Nation was released to white critics proclaiming the film a spectacle, a stupendous achievement, and remarkable, while black critics of the film believed that it appealed to the baser instincts of man in order to extract from their purse a pittance, and called for the show to be banned. Throughout the 20th century, the film was often defended by its boosters as art, but the movie only needed to be defended because of just how blatantly racist it is. The film is still shown to film students in high schools and college campuses across the world as a benchmark for the film industry, and to history students as an example of the Lost Cause narrative. But the racism depicted in the movie is shocking and can be harmful to those who do not have a grasp of the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction. For those of you who haven't seen the 1915 epic, one of our Roundtable participants, Paul McEwan, has an excellent summary in his 2022 book, Cinema's Original Sin. But in the interest of time, I will sum up Paul's summary. The film follows two families, the Southern Cameron family and Northern Stoneman family, and is divided into two parts. In the first part, the Stonemans, led by patriarch Austin Stoneman, a radical Republican politician and a clear stand-in for abolitionist Thaddeus Stevens, visit the Camerons in Piedmont, South Carolina, where enslaved people happily pick cotton. The Camerons' eldest son, Ben Cameron, later nicknamed the Little Colonel, falls for Elsie Stoneman, while her brother, Phil Stoneman, falls for the Camerons' daughter. The families are divided by the Civil War, and each family loses a son. The first half ends with a reproduction of the assassination of Lincoln at Ford's Theater. The second half of the movie opens with quotations from Woodrow Wilson's book, History of the American People, which states that radical congressional leaders determined to, quote, put the South under the heel of the Black South, put the white South under the heel of the Black South, and the Ku Klux Klan was created to protect the Southern country. The film then shows Black people taking over the defeated South, with a mixed race character, Austin Stoneman's protege, Silas Lynch, being elected as lieutenant governor of South Carolina. by barring white Southerners from voting and stuffing ballot boxes. After the election, Black people are forced to give up working, and the white South Carolinians are repressed. The youngest Cameron's sister, Flora, is pursued by a Black soldier, Gus, and chooses to throw herself from a cliff rather than submit to him. Ben Cameron forms the Ku Klux Klan after her suicide and lynches Gus. At the film's climax, Klan saves Elsie from being forced to marry Silas Lynch, forces all the Black people, other than the Cameron still faithful servants from Piedmont, and save the rest of the Cameron family and film stonemen who have taken refuge in a small Cameron with some Union veterans, quote, in common defense of the Aryan birthright, end quote. The film ends with Jesus Christ waving his hands over an all-white heaven and a final title card proclaiming liberty and union, one and inseparable, now and forever. So to put it mildly, the film is problematic. It uses racist tropes and stereotypes to push a narrative of white supremacy, which brings us to the questions for today's podcast. Can or should this film still be used in the classroom? How should historians and scholars of film use The Birth of a Nation, if at all? What can we still learn from the film about memory, the lost cause, Reconstruction, and filmmaking? So to help us answer these questions and others, I'm pleased to be joined by three amazing scholars. Firstly, Robert Bland is an assistant professor of American history at University of Tennessee, Knoxville, whose current book project examines the legacy of Reconstruction in the African-American public sphere, and specifically radical republicanism in South Carolina. Second, I am happy to welcome back to the show Ashleigh Lawrence-Sanders, assistant professor in African-American and U.S. history at University of Colorado Boulder. Her current book project entitled They Knew What the War Was About, African Americans and the Memory of the Civil War, explores Black Americans' long engagement with the legacy of the Civil War and the myths of the lost cause. And finally, Paul McEwan, professor of media and communications and film studies at Muhlenberg College and a fellow Canadian. His most recent book, Cinema's Original Sin, D.W. Griffith, American Racism and the Rise of Film Culture, traces the ways in which film culture has been shaped by having The Birth of a Nation as one of its earliest developmental milestones. So thank you all for coming to the show and welcome.
Thanks.
So I want to start off by asking each of you about your relationship with this movie. When was the first time you watched The Birth of a Nation? Why did you watch it? And what was your immediate reaction? When we start with Rob.
Yeah, the first times watching this was probably in college. You start to discover kind of this world of racist images in films, whether it's the kind of banned in Disney cartoons from the 40s and 50s with all the kind of anti-Black imagery there. I never remember watching it in a classroom, but kind of the historian of Southern history at Williams College would often discuss, right, kind of in teaching the kind of history of the New South, you have to kind of go through the kind of road of Birth of a Nation, and currently kind of as a historian of memory, as a historian of the South, as a historian of African-American memory, right? You can't talk about Reconstruction's memory, the legacy of Reconstruction in the United States without thinking through reading kind of literature on and teaching, I think, Birth of a Nation as kind of both a cinematic kind of milestone, but also kind of this really important kind of touchstone in cultural and sectional reconciliation and this story of kind of what does Reconstruction mean in the kind of memory of the American past.
I'd seen clip movie, I think, in classes in college, but it wasn't really until I was in graduate school and I was writing about Birth of a Nation that I was like, maybe I should actually sit down and watch the entire film. So I did sit and watch the entire 3-hour movie, and I was like, whoa, this is, this kind of larger than life movie, but actually sitting down and digesting it, in whole, and then like slower in parts over time as I wrote about it and wrote about the history of it in response in its entirety was when I was much older and really with mostly an academic mindset, to be honest. So I never really sat and watched it as sort of a popular viewer or consumer in that way. I only have actually ever consumed in an academic sense. So that was really the first time that I really sat and watched the film.
I think something similar is true for me in that I went to grad school, at 27 or something and started learning about silent film there. And I probably never watched a silent film other than, the sort of Chaplin and Keaton clips that we sort of stumble upon in our lives before that. So I would have seen it somewhere along the way there. And actually, I don't remember when I would have first seen it, but I assume in a film history class. But But I started using it. I was writing a dissertation about that was in part about film, the uses of film and film uses of historiography in film, and the idea that film scholars tended to be very forgiving of sort of tended to be social constructivists about history when they were writing about historical fiction films. Very forgiving. It doesn't matter. History doesn't matter. You sort of modernists when it came to doing film history, right? You go to the archives, you gather your facts, you follow the same sort of methods that historians have always held. And then, so I started writing about Birth of a Nation in the way that one picks an extreme example to prove a point, right? That no one would make the argument of Birth of a Nation that its distortions don't matter, or that it's an equally valid view of history or anything like that. And so I just picked it in that way, in the way you're trying to win an argument and you sort of reach for something extreme. And then while I was writing about that, I thought, wow, this actually, one of the things I discovered was when I was trying to research it was everything I found about it had the same 3 or 4 repeated facts about it, and I couldn't verify any of them. And so that seemed like a good place to do some historical research. When you keep reading the same things and you can't source any of them, then there's something that's just being repeated. And so there was all this mythology around the film. And so I thought, well, it'd be really interesting to start writing about the history of its reception. And I've been doing that for 20 years.
That's very interesting, like very kind of similar but different ideas of watching the movie. I was watching this movie for this podcast, and I had very similar ideas. It was very different, to say the least. So this movie, it came out in 1915. Stone Mountain, the Confederate monument in Georgia, was dated to the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1916 for the creation of said monument. Why was there a movement in the mid-1910s for more positive depictions of the Confederacy? And how does this movie really play into the wider field of Confederate memory? Ashleigh, do you want to take this one on first?
I mean, this is a big anniversary year. It's, 50 years out from the end of the war. America is undergoing these sort of massive changes nationally. We've gone through this high period of, we talked about in previous podcasts where, the monument landscape has already changed tremendously throughout the South, but it's about to undergo another big change. I think this is also a time too where in African American history, we're starting to see sort of the big sort of early pushes towards civil rights. Civil rights organizations are starting to gain ground. The NAACP is founded. Of course, some of their big, large campaigns are around fighting, elements of Birth of a Nation as well. Some of it's reactionary, right? Some of it's reactionary in establishing what they see as sort of a lost a lost sort of foothold in forms of history, in forms of memorialization at the time as well. Veterans themselves have been dying out. It's logical. 50 years after the end of a war, you're getting to the elderly age of being the youngest of the Civil War veterans or the Confederate veterans. The need to sort of cement in the minds of the new generations of people who are younger what the war was about for these people, the Old South, a glorious Old South, this sort of reifying what Confederate memory and the lost cause means for a younger generation, and new media, right, is essential. So I think that's why we see this kind of, this continued push during this era. It's like a turning over of generations in many ways. We're getting out of the generation of the lived memory into post memory, or whatever we want to call it, right? The next generations are taking on what people had lived through as veterans themselves and passing it on. So it's a very important time of switching from the war as a more lived experience for a population of people to, a very different sort of generational passed on experience.
Definitely. Paul, did you want to?
Yeah, in my case, one of the things that's really important is that the sort of modern Klan is refounded, particularly to coincide with the release of the film in Atlanta at the end of November in 1915. And so William Joseph Simmons, who's the sort of founder of the resurgent Klan, the Klan is essentially dead in this period, the original Klan, because it had achieved its original goal with the rise of Jim Crow. It wasn't sort of necessary because it had unfortunately been successful. And so, the film had been released in Los Angeles and New York in February and March of 1915. And in this period, and for most of film history, films were released slowly across the country. And so it didn't get to Atlanta until November, many months later, but it had been going across the country, Chicago in May or June, that kind of thing. And so there was time to sort of watch it coming. And so for someone to sort of realize that this was an opportunity to sort of capitalize on this. And so the Klan was refounded at this moment where it appears in Atlanta, and ads were taken out sort of facing pages with the film to say, let's, to sort of restart this and to sort of tie it to that. And then after that, it was used throughout the South as a Klan recruiting tool. Sometimes as an active, like let's have, as the Klan was resurgent, sometimes actively used, like booked to be a Klan recruiting tool. Other times the Klan would just sort of show up at screenings and recruit outside, signups, that kind of thing. And so that in any kind of combination that you can imagine. So it was used in that way for many, many years.
And Rob, what do you?
I would echo some of the points that the kind of been made before, and I would just add, right, the kind of 1915 really serves as a kind of pivotal turning point in this kind of the sectional history of the United States, right? Thinking about this as kind of the really kind of beginning of that first wave of the Great Migration. You kind of see kind of a transformation in African American life, kind of around kind of rejecting kind of the Jim Crow order. Right, this is the moment where the NAACP is kind of beginning to peak in large part, responding to this film, but also kind of making headway first in these kind of urban northern centers, and then by the time we get to World War I, we get this kind of campaign of the NAACP making real hay in organizing in the South, and obviously there's a counter reaction there. I really liked Ashleigh's point about this kind of story of generation, right? 1915 is the year where we lose both Robert Smalls and Booker T. Washington, kind of major figures in different parts of African-American life and history, right? Kind of part of a larger kind of swing of kind of a generation of kind of veterans who remembered the Civil War, who remember Reconstruction, kind of contested the kind of narratives of the kind of students of William Archibald Dunning as they're writing these histories, and right, these are becoming more pronounced parts of this national narrative, right? We have the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, who kind of in many ways is indebted to this kind of historical tradition that's redeeming the kind of ideas at the center of the Confederacy, at the center of the Lost Cause architects. And right, this is also a broader moment where we kind of think about kind of anxieties around urbanization, around immigration, and the second Ku Klux Klan, more than the first Ku Klux Klan, is organized not only around anti-Black racism, but it's organized around kind of xenophobia, kind of specifically targeting Catholic immigrants, thinking about the kind of ways that this is kind of trying to kind of move the nation in a more conservative direction, not only preserving kind of Jim Crow and kind of this kind of racist narrative of the Civil War and Reconstruction, but also, right, thinking about preserving kind of small towns, rural communities. And right, this is popular not only in the South, but right, kind of Klan is incredibly successful in parts of the Midwest. And right, this is kind of a broader turn against what many perceive as kind of the excesses of the 20th century, right? This kind of transformation, right? Many scholars, right, think in the long 19th century, in 1914, 1915, really the 20th century is beginning with World War I, and kind of you get the kind of immigration quotas, you get the kind of battles over school textbooks, teaching immigration. All these kind of forces are kind of part of this story of Birth of a Nation in the Second Ku Klux Klan.
So on that, like, similar note, Rob and Ashleigh, both of you write about memory, and specifically African-American memory of Reconstruction and the Civil War. When this movie was released, how were African-Americans thinking about the era?
I'll jump in, right? So, I mean, this is in many ways, right, a kind of constitutive moment for the early history of the NAACP, right? The kind of release of Birth of a Nation fits into a long history we might call anti-racist activism, right? We can think about as early in the 19th century, someone like Frederick Douglass understanding the importance of photography and image and combating kind of racist images around the minstrel show, just broadly, the kind of ways that African Americans in public life are depicted in all types of anti-Black ways. Birth of a Nation becomes this new modern way of depicting anti-Blackness, right? The kind of use of blackface, the kind of use of kind of these demeaning and dehumanizing stereotypes. The NAACP, right, kind of at its core and kind of through its kind of 20th century history, plays a kind of critical role in kind of responding to, rejecting, right, whether these are kind of protests at the kind of screenings of the film. We can think about someone like a William Monroe Trotter in Boston, kind of leading this kind of major protest where people get arrested and kind of have kind of confrontations with the state, confrontations with the police around kind of depiction and kind of dissemination of this film. James Weldon Johnson, right, kind of having already written the autobiography of an ex-colored man, kind of uses the pages of the New York Age to kind of challenge and kind of reject the kind of arguments made by D.W. Griffin, as well as Woodrow Wilson, and kind of defending the film, and right, kind of seeing the kind of Birth of a Nation represents this kind of new front in kind of anti-Black history, right, kind of lost cause history, but also kind of ways that this is part of a civil rights struggle. This is a part of a kind of 20th century struggle. It's not only a battle about kind of the past, but it's also a battle about the kind of continuation of a Jim Crow order, the struggle to get anti-lynching bills passed in the Congress, the kind of broad battle to kind of renew the fight for voting rights, for civil rights, and kind of building a 20th century Black freedom struggle.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on what Rob said, I think all the things are true. This is just such a quintessential thing where they're connecting, this sort of new type, this new sort of modern form of propaganda to struggles, the civil rights struggles, anti-lynching battles, new civil rights battles, the distortion of history, et cetera, political struggles. I think also importantly too, you brought up earlier that this is, during the first wave of the Great Migration, there's also this feeling within the African American community too that ideas about African Americans that are perpetrated through this film are being expanded nationally, right, through this platform, right? Negative stereotypes about African Americans. You see a lot of concern in the Black press about ideas like Southern ideas about Black people spreading to the North. Now, we can say that some of these racist ideas already existed in the North, of course, but there is a real concern that, white Northerners are looking to white Southerners to explain, Black people to them, as we're seeing an increase of Black people moving to northern cities, Midwestern cities during these first waves of the Great Migration. A film like Birth of a Nation, which is nationally, premiering in many of these different cities, Boston, New York, all these places, right? And carrying this particular message with it is seen as having an extra concern, right? The same sort of concern that folks saw with the Dunning School, which is that it is spreading a particular historical message, right, to places where it might have had some foothold, but now it has an extra sort of weight behind it, right? So whereas Southern historians may have been in their Southern universities, now they're at Columbia, right? And then they're spreading throughout the nation and then back to their Southern universities and having a very huge pull in how this history is taught. Now you're seeing an interpretation of the Civil War and Reconstruction, right, now being spread through film, this new and popular medium, throughout the nation. People are watching this film in LA, they're watching it in Boston, they're watching it. And so, who knows what ideas they might have had about how Southerners thought about the war, but now they're seeing it, right? They're seeing it in this kind of like new way. So this is a real concern. I think that when you read from, the activists at this time and the historians at this time, and it's a real concern that of the Southernization of the North and the way that the, African Americans will be viewed as they're coming into these spaces in greater numbers, is that they're already going to face a level of prejudice and racism that already exists in the North, and that it will be reified through this new sort of form of propaganda.
Just on that same note, Paul, like in 1915, where was film at? Like, how did Americans view the film industry, and how did Birth of a Nation really change filmmaking or fit into that idea of film?
Yeah, well, so that's the thing. It's in this sort of transitional moment. We often talk about this period between about 1907, 08 to about 1915 as this kind of trend, literally as a sort of transitional era. The period before that is the kind of I'm oversimplifying, but a sort of mostly sort of non-narrative, right? This way, the period we talk about the sort of cinema of attractions, film as something that is sort of new and it's about sort of showing off. And then between 1907 and 1915, it sort of develops into the more sort of narrative focused medium that we see. And the period in their sort of early teens is really the sort of beginnings of kind of narrative features, like more fully developed stories with sort of complex character development. And so it is something that is developing. And at this point in 1915, when Birth of a Nation appears, if it were a different film that had just been what it was, right? Like if I always sort of imagine this alternate history in which Birth of a Nation really was this story about brotherly love and understanding that Griffith claimed it was. It really was this sort of amazing cultural event in that it didn't play in regular movie theaters. It played in legit theaters with high ticket prices. You went in and there was a printed program. Like the earliest prints don't have the credits in them because the credits were in a printed program. And so it was designed to sort of elevate the entire experience of film. Cinema had been associated with a kind of sort of a low class, urban immigrant experience, a place that decent people don't go. And Griffith was trying to elevate it, trying to get film to get respect as an art form. Coincidentally, the same month that this film comes out, the Supreme Court rules that film is emphatically not an art form, that it's a business pure and simple. But that's unrelated to this. It's a coincidence that happens at the same time. And so this film comes at this moment, and it is this sort of massive blockbuster. It succeeds beyond his kind of wildest dreams, not just financially, but also does succeed in elevating the status of film. Not in the first few months, but as it kind of sort of plays, you really see a shift in the way that people talk about this film and start to talk about film. Within a year after 1915, it's much more common in the press to see people talk about, in general, just start talking about film as an art form in a way that they didn't before this film came out. So it kind of works. And you can see that in that already there's this kind of, in the same time as these discussions are happening among both the NAACP and then with Black critics and other journalists, this obvious frustration that this is this object and this sort of fear of the power of it that it's going to have. And especially with some of the critics, you can see this recognition that they get the duality of it, that they understand the reason this is dangerous is because it's like quote unquote good, right? That it's well made propaganda, that it's well crafted propaganda, right? In the sense that it's not that if it was a sort of a terribly made piece of propaganda, it would fall away like a million other pieces of trash. But it's actually the craftsmanship of it is what makes it so dangerous, that it's going to appeal to people. And so that it's got this power to sort of go beyond. And so, as Ashleigh pointed out, it's going to travel around the country. And also, just to sort of add, to add on to that, this film also goes all over the world. And one of the things you really see when it travels is in other countries where people have no experience of American, I should say no experience of American history, but very little. Even journalists or people who are reviewers, they mostly take the history at absolutely face value. They're like, wow, we really didn't know that this is what had happened in history. And like, wow, our eyes are open now. And so it does that kind of damage that Ashleigh and Rob are referring to and that the NAACP feared. It does it, sort of all over the world.
Right. Yeah. Like that was pretty much what I thought the first time I watched it. Well, a couple of weeks ago, was that if somebody doesn't understand Civil War or Reconstruction, this film can be incredibly harmful. And to get to the movie itself, I don't want to completely skip over the first part of the movie, but I think the second half is really the most important part. But before we get there, I do want to talk about the last few scenes of the first part, that being the assassination of Lincoln and the character's reaction to it. Booth is still portrayed as a villain, despite assassinating Lincoln for the ideals of the Confederacy that the movie celebrates. It even called Lincoln the South's best friend. At the same time, Stoneman is portrayed as the true villain at that moment, with the Camerons sad and dour over Lincoln's assassination, and Stoneman and his mixed race partner scheming over his death. How does the movie really square that circle? How does Lincoln become the hero of the South? I don't know if we want to start with Ashleigh and then Paul and then Rob.
I think it just speaks to where Lincoln is in American sort of memory at this moment, sort of American national memory. I don't think you can make a national movie and villainize Lincoln, a movie that's going to be nationally appealing and villainize Lincoln. Somehow Lincoln cannot be a villain, but you can still make the Confederate a sympathetic force in these movies, which then continues and is sort of a trope in movies for many generations, actually, where you have a sympathetic Confederate soldier, or you have a sympathetic Confederate view, but Lincoln somehow like still is this heroic figure. I think that by this point, Lincoln, has fairly established, outside of the South, I would say, but maybe within the South, I think Lincoln is fairly established as like this, he's one of the greatest presidents. He tried at least, he was, we have tried to make, you know, Lincoln was this sort of, a savior of the nation or whatever. This is, ahead of, the Lincoln Memorial pops up, what, 1920s, early 1920s. So we're getting to this point where we have a national memorialization of Lincoln coming up, right? So this says a lot about where Lincoln has in the national consciousness, but it's so easy, right? Because Lincoln is not a radical Republican. He's not your, Stoneman Stevens-ish figure, right? That is so much easier to villainize because in the Reconstruction historiography, those are the villains. It is not Lincoln that are the villains in that Reconstruction historiography, right? It is your Stevens, your Sumners, your carpetbaggers who are going down to the South, the Black politicians who are corrupt and who have the overreach, right? Because Lincoln is assassinated. And so everything that happens after that, right, is the real problem because those people just went too far. They just did too much to, ruin the South and upend everything else. And so, the scheming Stoneman and Lydia, I think her name is, they're just, they're sitting there just like, this is it's so convenient, right? So we can preserve the saint like Lincoln, right? And then we can just like, villainize all these other people who people don't know much about. Thaddeus Stevens, people don't know much about Charles Sumner still, I would argue. They don't know as much about those figures and what they stand for. Definitely not probably in 1915. So, but they know about Lincoln. And this film would not be successful if you would have made Lincoln into a villainous figure, I would argue. You just couldn't.
Yeah, I think that's it. It doesn't have to sort of make logical sense. It's just the kind of rhetorical move for all the reasons that Ashley points out. And I would say that it's the best sort of analogy, and I talked about this in my book, is the way that Martin Luther King gets used now, right? You can't, on the right, you can't criticize him. So you do the exact same move that Ashley talked about. There's, you see signs that say, MLK, not CRT. Right, you just divide all the people that you're fighting against from the good, person, and you, of course, you don't actually talk about what Martin Luther King actually wrote about or stood for or anything. You just, sort of rip apart all of his legacy to just make him a symbol of your own reasonableness, right? And in the face of the sort of radicals who are now that you're fighting. And there's the same thing I wrote at the very end of my book. I wrote about the Trump released 1776 project, which was released on Martin Luther King Day, which is 3 days before Trump left office. And it does almost exactly that move that Ashley's talking about. It says something complimentary about Martin Luther King, and it says, unfortunately, his legacy was sullied, I'm paraphrasing, by radicals who both before and after kind of destroyed his legacy. So it basically decides to take his accomplishment, but takes it away from the people both before and after who actually did those things. And so I think it's basically the same move here, where you just try to take the sort of racist people, take the credit for the progress from the people who did it.
Yeah, and I'll add on, it's important to kind of remember how much the first half of the movie is the cinematic invention, right? The kind of second half is drawn pretty directly from Thomas Dixon Jr. as the Klansman and kind of that kind of battle over the meaning of Reconstruction, right? This kind of imagining of Reconstruction as this kind of nadir in kind of the history of America, not just the history of the white South, has to be kind of mapped onto something else, right? And kind of, I think Griffin kind of understanding that there's needs to be a broader story here. And even with Lincoln, right? Lincoln is not the kind of main character here, right? The kind of battle at the kind of core of this film, right, is this kind of story of the Stonemans and the Camerons, right? And kind of, and by extension, right, this kind of story of sectional reconciliation, right? And kind of Lincoln, obviously kind of playing a major figure in American history, is kind of a minor kind of figure, the rational figure, right? And this kind of fits into this kind of broader Dunning School kind of narrative, right? That kind of, as Ashleigh kind of pointed out, depicts the kind of radical Republicans and also the abolitionists as kind of not understanding compromise, not understanding the kind of American center, right? And kind of by the time we get to the 20th century, right, the kind of cultural project of cultural reconciliation has been one not only in the kind of academy, but also more broadly in kind of public memory. And that kind of sectional reconciliation story emphasizes the centrists, right? It emphasizes the moderates. I mean, Lincoln, therefore, gets kind of reclaimed as a figure who kind of pushes the kind of abolitionists to the side, is kind of uses the pocket veto to kind of push forward initially a more radical vision of Reconstruction, right? Kind of his legal kind of understanding that the kind of South was never legally out of the United States, right? And kind of by the time we get to the late 19th, early 20th century, historians, often white Southern historians, are able to square Lincoln as a kind of reasonable, if not heroic figure, and kind of imagine counterfactual histories where if Lincoln had survived, you would not have had radical Reconstruction. The nation would have pursued a more moderate path. The South would have been kind of included as a kind of more full-throated kind of partner in the kind of post-bellum United States.
So on that kind of that similar note of reflecting people, the title card at the beginning of the second half states that the movie is not, and quote, is not meant to reflect on any race or people today. Was this in actuality meant to reflect Black Americans in 1915? How did this film play into the goals of segregationists, lawmakers, white supremacists, and others in 1915? When we just do the reverse order, start with Rob, then Paul, then Ashleigh.
Right. By the time we get to this film, I mean, we already have disfranchisement by the late 19th century, and by disfranchisement directly leads to those Jim Crow laws, right? Kind of as early as 1890, you get the Separate Car Act. So this is more of a defense of that order, right? This is kind of, it comes in and kind of people kind of already are using the kind of narratives of the kind of Dunning School to kind of defend the kind of process of disfranchisement. What this film does in many ways is kind of serve as the crescendo, right? It kind of becomes the most popular, most visible, but also the kind of, I mean, most powerfully told, right? And that it's told in the cinematic language that's accessible, it's innovative, it kind of, it's, as Paul's kind of sharply said, right, kind of redefines, right, kind of American cinematic language. By the time we get to 1915, right, the kind of, we have a solid South, right, kind of the last pockets of kind of Republican power are kind of have been quashed. Kind of the Democratic Party has a kind of iron-clad vice grip on kind of Southern politics. The kind of Southern wing of the Democratic Party determines the direction of national policy regarding the Democrats on civil rights, on anti-lynching. And so the film is really coming at the end, it's kind of serving as the capstone of this kind of generational story, this generational march towards Jim Crow. But in many ways, right, it kind of makes clear not only to Southerners, but to the broader nation, right? It kind of, this is the story of the kind of battle over textbooks, the battle of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, that the kind of Jim Crow order is logical, it's intellectually serious, and at a gut level, right? It makes sense in terms of its gender politics, its racial politics, and its kind of defense of a Southern order.
Yeah, it's always tricky to talk about sort of Griffith's intentions without sort of sounding like you're letting him off, and especially because for a long time in film history, part of what I wrote about in this book is that one of the sort of key arguments is that because film is kind of a late comer to the kind of artistic club, for 50 years or for 100 years, people who love film, who want it to be included in the kind of pantheon of arts, have needed artistic masterpieces, right? Art and literature, you've got masterpieces and great artists, or you got masterpieces and great artists. And one of those is D.W. Griffith. And because we want to get included, that has meant, excusing Griffith, whitewashing him and all those kinds of things. So it's really hard to talk about his kind of intentions without sounding like I'm taking part in that. And I have no desire whatsoever to do that. So I'm going to echo a bit about what Robert was saying as well, in that Griffith, as much as Griffith, he didn't set out to sort of make sort of racist film that was going to put people in their place. He didn't set out to make a controversial film in a way that Dixon clearly did. Like, there's written stuff that I found really sort of late, that he was in interviews from later. He was like, "Yeah, I knew I was really going to like light a fuse with this, and that's where I was playing it." There's no evidence that Griffith was trying to try to do that, but as Robert said, like, that's what let it go so far. Like, the fact that Griffith kind of toned down some of Dixon's racism is actually what allowed it to do so much damage, right? That's not a sort of a plus, in the sense that, like, oh, it wasn't so bad. And so I don't want to echo that argument, because that is the argument that a lot of film historians made for a long time. Oh, well, it's not as bad as Dixon, as if that made it okay. And that's obviously not. And also, as I said, that's what Dixon was already popular. His play and his novel were popular, but it was Griffith's ability to say, okay, well, to take it from to take away the pages of racist speeches and focus, just what you could get at, sort of what was, to make it palatable and to sugarcoat it, is what allowed that to go really far. But one of the other arguments, up until relatively recently, articles published into the 2000s by film historians were still trying to make the case that, oh, well, this film is really about the Reconstruction. It's not fair to say it's about 1915. It's not fair to pin it on the period. And there's a couple of examples that are in the film, right? There's when Silas Lynch is first introduced in the South to the Little Colonel, it's Elsie's friend, and he refuses to shake his hand, and that's presented as a moment of high-minded principle. And there's no way to read that scene as anything other than that he recognizes them as a mixed race character. His like the girl he likes friend, and she's introducing him, and he just looks at him and immediately from the get-go refuses to shake his hand. And there's several other moments like that, about equality. We're supposed to be shocked when Thaddeus Stevens announces that Silas Lynch is something about his radical proposition that blacks shall be raised to full equality with the whites. And so those moments are not for the civil rights period. We're supposed to be shocked in 1915 that someone would ever suggest such a thing. So there clearly is a kind of a racist agenda in this film for 1915 that Griffith wholeheartedly believed in. And he lived long enough and listened to all of this arguments and all of this criticism for the next 30 years. And he had plenty of time to think about it and reflect, and to maybe consider that maybe he'd been wrong about it. He never once cracked. He never once said, "Okay, I see your point." Never once. And he had all sorts of opportunities. He even made Intolerance, which was about other kinds of intolerance at different periods in history, and meant for that to be about how people had been intolerant toward him. Even making that, he still could not see how. Even when it was pointed out to him explicitly, he still couldn't see how that related to this. So it really is unambiguously part of a racist agenda for 1915, and meant to promote a kind of a segregation and white supremacy in 1915 unambiguously.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Rob and Paul said, I think, the racial politics of this film aren't just representing to me, a reflection of an earlier time period. It seems like you said things that should, or were portrayed to be shocking, in this moment. Even the relationship itself between Stoneman and his housekeeper, right? Even the presentation of a Jezebel type, mixed race housekeeper that's devious, and we're supposed to dislike her immediately. And there's something signaling something to the audience in this moment. People don't watch this and think, oh, well, this is how we would have thought back in no, they're thinking 1915. This is a kind of character that I would not like and not trust, right? Or I wouldn't like the Stoneman figure. I wouldn't like Silas Lynch. Mixed race people are inherently distrustful, is what this film is telling us, right? The two main mixed race characters are distrustful people who are sexually promiscuous and, are also devious and all of these things, right? They're villainous characters. This is something we should know and understand in this film. Also, the film is very much playing with the politics of the time. I think, I've read many times that, Dixon himself wanted in particular, along with Griffin, to insert quotes from Wilson's own histories so that it had this particular connection to Wilson also, so that, of all the histories to include, right, quotes from, of course, Wilson's histories get in there, right? So this particular connection to this, this politician at the time also. And yeah, the idea that, of Black equality, of a specific Black equality, the heroism of like, these white people in the South being saved, right, from militia force, how we view Black soldiers and Black politicians in 1915, how we're viewing Black soldiers, that Civil War part of the film is a film, part that we do kind of brush over, but I think that part is actually really fascinating because it's actually telling us also what they think about the Civil War. These awful Black soldiers that are coming in and ransacking the town, the guerrilla soldiers or whatever, the Black militia units coming in. What are we supposed to think about Black Civil War soldiers, right? In this film, we're supposed to think they're awful, they're undisciplined. Like these are minor things, but these depictions matter. And they also reflect the fact of a very sort of resolved form of Dunning School history in 1915, that this is a history that is absolutely resolved as being understood to be true, right? That this is how the history is taught and thought of in this time period. So I do think that this idea that this doesn't reflect any kind of people or anything, even beyond, what Griffith himself, would have said or thought, it just can't be true, just, in the way that they're presenting, leading the audience to think and believe certain things, because that there's parts where you're supposed to agree, right, with a certain sentiment in the film. Most films always do that. You're supposed to like agree a character as a villain, agree a character as a hero. You're supposed to agree the Klan is the hero, right? They come in at the end. We're all supposed to agree the Klan is a hero, except those of us who know, Black people in 1915 thinking the Klan a hero, right? Like we know who this is for. So it's signaling a particular type of imagery for people who have either, this kind of like idea already, or who have not thought through Civil War history and memory in this 1915 moment. And now they're having this even further, I think, implanted in their sort of memory scape, that this is what, the war and Reconstruction was like.
So to actually build off what you were just saying, I really wanted to touch on the Black characters, because in this film, they're just caricatures. Their hair, language, and physicality, as well as non-physical characteristics like deceitfulness and sexuality and ignorance, play into the infamous and harmful stereotypes of African Americans. Where do these stereotypes come from, and what is the objective in depicting Black people this way? And I have a follow-up question, which is, what is the difference between characters like Gus and Silas Lynch and Mammy and the Cameron's other loyal servant? Why is there the dichotomy between these two groups of characters? And we start with Ashleigh again. And
I mean, we do see sort of this full, I think, stereotypical range of archetypes around both enslaved sort of characters. The Mammy archetype is there, the Jezebel character is there, and as much as our good histories about enslaved women have told us about why and what these archetypes serve, right? You want the loyal, faithful servant, and this Mammy is like the backbone of all of like the lost cause, like emblems of what enslavement supposedly looked like, right? Faithful, loyal servants who were just dutifully doing their duty to the South. And this is why the UDC tries to erect a monument to Mammy on the National Mall. Sort of, they start doing this around this time, I think, in the early 1920s. This is why like Mammy becomes this figure that white women themselves try to, basically embody and go around and have their Mammy shows where they all sort of do like Mammy performances. And this is why like having a mammy or having a memory of a mammy becomes an important Southern memory of authenticity for white people. So having a mammy character in this film was almost, I guess, a given, right? If you're going to show like an authentic Southern family, right? And then, the idea of like, house, enslaved women in a household, mixed race women in particular, or Black women in a household being, a promiscuous woman, right? Over sexualized woman, and that she's, she's seductive and she's tempting, and this is like her entire personality. We get the myth of the Black male rapist, right, through these mixed race men, in the film, and it's very interesting that these are the politicians that are supposed to be educated, so they're also, you know, the myth of like the corrupt Black male politician figure sort of marries with the myth of the Black male rapist in this film as well. We get this sort of the whole broad range of stereotypes of like not a complete Black character, nor do I expect to see one. And on top of that, of course, all of the main Black characters are played by white people in blackface. um, um, which of course is, yes, fairly common, I think, in film at this time, but it adds another layer to these portrayals, right? So you get the exaggerated sort of physical, like, performances, et cetera, in this film, how they even look, how their faces are darkened in a particular way, I think is also really interesting to, portray these sort of characteristics. I think that, it is necessary in this film to portray a wide range of how Black people are expected to be in this moment, right? To the point of how like this film is, also, conveying certain ideas about Black Americans, right? They are, ignorant. They're, it's the Black male rapist at a time when, lynching is common and they're trying to pass these anti-lynching laws. You're portraying, a Black male rapist, right, in this film. At a time when, of course, like Black women are still experiencing high levels of sexual violence. They're portraying Black women characters being, overly sexual and promiscuous. These things serve to further, like, basically cause the idea that, Black women can't be sexually assaulted. These are how Black women are. Black men are always guilty of these crimes that we think Black men have committed. These are ideas that are still common in American consciousness in 1915. So this film goes a very long way to continue to perpetrate the stereotypes against Black people that serve both political and social purposes. I think that was really important to highlight, because in Reconstruction, they served heavy, political purposes in terms of like how Reconstruction is sort of dismantled. But the social purposes for a long term for understanding, continued subjugation of Black people. Yeah, it's still doing that work in 1915.
Yeah, one of the really important things that the range of characters do is provide a defense for Griffith for the next 30 years. And that one of the things he repeats over and over is the film can't be racist because we showed good and bad white people and good and bad Black people, right? The mammy characters and the loyal servants are the good Black people, and obviously we're aware of those as stereotypes, as not sort of good portrayals. But to him, that was his defense, and so therefore the film sort of can't be racist, right? We showed that, and other people took that up as well in the kind of defense of it. And obviously there was that tradition. There's a long tradition of blackface that came from theater and from minstrel shows and other things. Someone pointed out to me recently that that even if they had if they'd wanted to, because there's the scenes of these mixed race characters chasing white women around, kind of handling them, casting an actual Black actor would have been a challenge for the moment too, which is something I hadn't thought of myself. So there's that loaded into it as well. But to go back to one of the things we were saying about this as a sort of a transitional moment and the sort of beginning of cinema, one of the things I'm always kind of aware of is, because cinema is new, and because it is otherwise a kind of an invention that is part of modernity. There's this sense, and that I always have, of this kind of lost possibility that because this film in particular is so influential, it takes all of these old stereotypes which did exist, as Ashleigh has pointed out, and we know come from minstrel shows and from theater and from other places, and draws them into film, and then they stay in film for a long, long time. Whereas film could have been this break, it could have been this modern invention that shifted things in some way, and it just didn't. It drew the kind of one of the sort of worst aspects of American culture sort of forward into the modern era.
And I'll just add, and I'll echo the kind of points that Paul and Ashleigh made, that the kind of the danger here, right, and kind of the kind of perversion here is, right, how quotidian, right, like all these images are, right, that this would not have registered as racist in kind of American popular culture, right? The kind of folks who are at the vanguard of a certain type of anti-racism, whether it's like groups like the NAACP, figures like William Monroe Trotter, immediately recognize, right? They come from a long tradition and a long history that's contesting and counteracting these anti-Black images, and I know the kind of danger that type of cultural work does. But for most Americans, right, kind of consuming the minstrel show, right, consuming kind of the Sambo figure in postcards and children's books and kind of song lyrics, right, the kind of playing darky, right, kind of the kind of things that people do when they went to college and, right, kind of would have worn blackface in a fraternity or a sorority, right? That was all just part of the American cultural landscape. That was part of the American public sphere, right? And that was the kind of danger here, right? The kind of the fight to get that out of the public sphere was I mean, we do a disservice when we kind of don't kind of think with the gravity that the NAACP attacks that type of anti-Black kind of image in the cultural sphere, the same way that they're kind of attacking the anti-lynching, right? The anti-lynching is going to be kind of someone's immediate death, right? That is a type of literal violence, but the kind of cultural violence that kind of is pervasive allows for the kind of arguments for lynching, the arguments for segregation, the arguments for disfranchisement also to persist, right? So they have to all be part of this kind of broad anti-racist kind of struggle, right? The kind of battle against the images has to coincide with the kind of battle for the ballot box, the battle to get anti-lynching bills passed. Those are all part of this struggle because they're all part of the same architecture, right? And it's a quotidian architecture of white supremacy at the beginning of the 20th century.
Right. And so I have like 3 more questions that I want to get to. Well, I have like 10 more questions I want to get to, but I have 3 that I really want to get to. So this one, like Silas Lynch states close to the end of the film that he wants to build a Black empire. What in the minds of people like Griffith was this Black empire supposed to be? Did people who fought against Reconstruction actually ever fear a Black empire, or was this like a 20th century invention? Rob, do you want to start?
Right. No, there's a certain geographic specificity at the same time that it fictionalizes a place like Piedmont, South Carolina, very much, right? This is a story of South Carolina, and South Carolina is one of a handful of states that has a Black majority in the years that follow the Civil War. And from that, right, the kind of people like Thomas Dixon Jr., people like D.W. Griffith would have been familiar not only with those kind of images of the kind of first state legislature that kind of for a handful of years gives South Carolina a majority in the lower house in terms of a Black majority, but also, right, this kind of idea that the state's kind of demographic Black majority would kind of lead to Negro supremacy, right, or Negro domination, right? These kind of watchwords that become kind of animating forces for redemption. And when we talk about redemption, we're talking about the kind of reclaiming of Southern states for white supremacy through kind of tremendous amounts of extra legal violence, kind of organizations like the Red Shirts in South Carolina, led by someone like Benjamin Tillman, who goes on to become governor of South Carolina, later becomes senator for South Carolina, talks about, right, kind of organizes his campaigns in the 1890s around the kind of threat of Reconstruction memory, talks about like Negro supremacy, talks about the low country counties, a place like Beaufort, as niggerdoms, right? The kind of idea that these are places where demographically, these are counties that are 80–90% African American, and that these kind of Black majorities could at some point reanimate, right, kind of the political order that was Reconstruction, right? And by the time we get to Birth of a Nation, right, part of the kind of argument, the kind of claim that has to be made over and over again to kind of keep disfranchisement kind of the order of the day is kind of highlighting the kind of danger of the 1870s order. And it's part of the kind of tricky history that the kind of Dixon and later Griffin is doing in this film, right? The kind of film really starts in 1870. You don't get 1865 to 1867. This is something John Hope Franklin points out, right? The kind of, you don't get this kind of immediate postbellum order where former Confederates go back to the state houses. They go back to they're elected to the Senate in the fall of 1865, right? The kind of Ku Klux Klan and kind of white supremacy is the order of the day. You do get the black codes, and you have to have kind of a protracted struggle between the moderate Republican wing of the Republican Party about kind of what is to be done. How do you move about with military reconstruction? This is all battle over black politics. You have similar struggles in places like Louisiana, places like Mississippi, which also has a black majority. But the kind of idea that that African Americans would not only have political power, but that political majority would mean that you have African American political power over white Americans, right? It's a kind of it's an argument for Anglo-Saxonism, right? And the kind of this idea of Anglo-Saxonism is persistent in the late 19th century, and it's again becomes quotidian by the time we get to the 20th century, where the kind of the racial order, the racial hierarchy, certainly kind of would mean that at best African Americans have to be at the bottom of a rung, and kind of maybe over decades can kind of embrace white Anglo-Saxon values and kind of receive some political power, and that's only kind of respectable, kind of have the right levels of education, the right levels of kind of embracement of white Victorian values. But the kind of more noxious argument, right, is that no, there is kind of biological differences between black and white, and that organizes, right, we get the height of scientific racism, which is also happening at the same time that we have the kind of lost cause argument being made. And the kind of, if you embrace that argument, then kind of any type of political order where African Americans, but also more broadly, right, you kind of have any type of black and brown peoples in the global South calling for political self-determination flies in the face of that Anglo-Saxonism, right? And kind of the birth of a nation is very much indebted to, even if the kind of filmmaker claims that he sees good people and bad people, the kind of African Americans who are heroes understand their place at the kind of bottom of that social hierarchy, right? The kind of logic of Birth of a Nation is very much an Anglo-Saxon logic. It's very much a white supremacist logic. And it's very much kind of embracing a specific argument that you see in the 1870s and 1880s around Negro domination and Negro supremacy, right? And you kind of can see that one political cartoon that comes out in 1898 with the kind of coup d'etat that happens in Wilmington, North Carolina. And you have this kind of African-American figure who's kind of portrayed as half Sambo, half vampire, flying over this kind of community in Wilmington. And it kind of has this kind of this specter of Negro domination, and kind of you have white women and running from this kind of demonic, dangerous figure, right? And that kind of figure, right, kind of is meant to kind of highlight that kind of this biracial government that's very moderate, that's very conservative, but still has African Americans in political office at the end of the 19th century as this kind of deep threat to kind of not only white supremacy, but white womanhood, right?
Yeah, just to echo that, it's there's all these places Robert points out, there's places where there is a kind of a fear of a black majority, but you don't really sort of need that majority. All you need is this fear of any black political power at all. And this, the call of this, I'll present an empire, is that way of elevating that fear of any black political power into they're going to take over, right? It's the same thing as the sort of modern like great replacement theory or anything like that, right? You just take this like any modicum of it, or the hysteria over DEI initiatives, or like suppression of black history in various US states, all of that kind of thing. All of that is even kind of modicum, or the massive backlash to the election of Barack Obama that we're all living through at the moment. All of those things, that even sort of small amounts of black political power are treated as these tremendous threats to a social order. And so that's the film is just doing that, playing on that fear of like, what if, to white people, what if we don't have full and absolute control, while pretending that it's not about that, right? You can't say that part. You can't say that we must have full and absolute control, and people just stay on the bottom. And so you pretend that it's this threat, which is right. The same move with DEI, and same move with everything. You pretend that, oh, really, they're just radically poisoning our children's brains by what? Like teaching them, letting them read books about Harriet Tubman, right? So you always have to elevate that threat so that you can quash it back down. So the film's just doing that same move that unfortunately not only is still in motion, but unfortunately still works.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to me specifically, that always signaled one, a very distinct reference to, the Dunning School, et cetera, folks, cry of Negro rule being, the end goal of what Reconstruction was and what it could have been if it had been allowed to continue, right? But also, to Rob's point, very specific South Carolina level politics as well, these dangerous states where Black people were the majority, not necessarily in the Piedmont, but yeah, the low country, you had all these counties where Black people were 80, 90%. These places were seen as dangerous because they were not so easily controlled. You would not have seen the Klan marching through a low country county. It just didn't happen because it was 80, 90% Black, in those spaces. And the politics, they were very dangerous. And the lack of control that those groups of people could have over those places is what they were really worried about. The idea of Silas saying he's building a Black empire is an empire where Black people are actually like the majority of the people in power, which if you look at, the demographics of those areas, which is actually would have made sense, right? If they were actually electing representative places in those counties, then there would have been a lot more Black politicians in places like Mississippi and South Carolina, even Louisiana, and some of these states, right, that had much higher percentages of African Americans. Too, if you're looking at, what's happening in the Great Migration, the idea of like, oh, these people coming into these cities, right? The fear of like increasing Black neighborhoods, increasing Black spaces, that could easily play into those fears, right? We're seeing very much the competition over space and, in these urban places that's starting to occur in Philadelphia, in parts of New York and in Chicago and all these areas that then lead, into these violent conflicts we see over the next like 10, 20 years in those spaces. The idea of like an invasive force, I think Paul's correct that this is like the precursor to the great replacement theory in many ways, right? That not only is a group going to come in, they are going to take over, right? They are going to rule, they're going to create their own government, and somehow you will be secondary in the way that you made them secondary, right? We know the Southern United States is very much a hair and vote democracy, right? So why, is this fear, even in 1915 that, this, we're going to make a Black empire and like, oh, the Klan ultimately saves, the Klan ultimately and all these white militia groups ultimately saves the South from, an instance of Black rule and instead, corrects a racial order of white rule in these places. And that's the natural order of things, right? That Silas's speech is upending what should naturally happen, which is that white people should be in rule. And like you said, it's presented as this sort of, yeah, of course it's a bad, this is a bad thing, but they're actually laundering what they're saying is that, no, Black people should not be in power, period. That's what that's essentially what they're saying without saying it. The fear of Black political power, the fear of Black power, the fear of like Black, politicians, Black Reconstruction in its like full term, a Black radical Reconstruction where Black people actually have political power. That is the fear in the 1870s. And, this is still the fear in 1915, right? This is definitely the fear still of Southerners. This is why Black people are so disenfranchised, but it definitely is speaking to a national fear as well, right? I think it can say that as, the places that were previously less Black are becoming more diverse, more Black people are moving into them, it could speak to those people, right? If they're of any all concern about the number of Black people who are moving into their cities and their spaces, this will definitely speak to them. A Silas Lynch warning them that he wants to create a Black empire, while he also wants to marry these white women and all the things that, gets people afraid and all this sort of propaganda around that, complete Black control, right? Yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting speech in that film.
Yeah, it's why it's also really important at the end that besides Jesus and whatever, there's a key scene of the next election, which shows Black voters being prevented from going to the polls. That's one of the crucial like denouements of the film, right? Of the sort of new piece is that Black voters don't get to vote. Period.
So, moving forward in time with this film, how did the particular depictions of African Americans in Birth of a Nation differ from other famously racist movies like Gone with the Wind and Song of the South? What differentiates this film and those two in particular, or even other racist films that came out throughout the 20th century?
I mean, the Klan violence here is, the Klan violence here is, it seems, is the kind of flashpoint, right? The kind of Gone with the Wind, in those edits with the studio, right? Kind of depictions of the Klan wants to defend a antebellum South, but without the kind of birth of a nation kind of inflections, right? And not to say that Gone with the Wind or kind of Song of the South don't have those kind of horrific moments of anti-Black imagery, but the depiction of the kind of most murderous kind of version of the Klan, as heroic, as chivalrous, as knightly, captures something that's a real nadir in kind of history of kind of anti-Black images.
I was going to say that I think, precisely because we don't get, I think to Paul's point earlier about what was taken out from Dixon's original text, also because we don't get the as visceral images of the Klan that actually are more directly included in Mitchell's novel. In Gone with the Wind, it is more palatable as a movie, right, than Birth of a Nation is. It's a romantic film. You can say that the whole plot around the Civil War and Reconstruction may be secondary to the romantic story of, Scarlett and her messy love life. But, this is precisely why a lot of Black activists saw it as more dangerous than Birth of a Nation, because it lulled so many people into this very romanticized image of the South that like the political elements of it just wash over you as just there, as just, as understood, right? Like all these things around the Civil War and Reconstruction understood. Mammy's place in the household just understood. Mammy is an act played by an actual Black woman, Hattie McDaniel, right? And that's like the big defense. The Black characters are played by actual Black people, Black actors and Black, same thing in Song of the South. And I think Hattie McDaniel is also in Song of the South. And, these characters also played by Black actors in this role. So it's like, well, we have actual Black actors. They agreed to it. So of course, what can we say? But, the depictions of how like the history of the war itself and then Reconstruction and carpetbaggers and the politics around all of that are described. The politics aren't really that different than Birth of a Nation when you really get down to it, right? Reconstruction bad, for the South, right? The Civil War was this glorious cause and we lost it, and we have to try to regain, what we lost in this war somehow. We all have these loyal servants. Sam and Pork are going off to march off to the war somehow to go help the Confederate cause, which, I always think it's so crazy how they're like marching off and they're like singing Go Down Moses. I'm like, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. Like, what is happening in this moment? That drives me crazy, by the way. But I think that I think these movies later are created, they have this nostalgia, right? These movies are more sophisticated too, right? They have this nostalgia at a time that there's built in, beautiful imagery, there's a storyline there, there's a narrative that draws you in, while the historical element of it seems so in the background, but it's so in the background that it's just understood to be true, right? You don't have to think too much about what Scarlett or any of these people believe about the Civil War or about slavery or about anything, because it's just there, right? No one's debating anything about anything. It's just known, right? The war destroyed them. It's a bad thing. Sam and Pork and Mammy, all of them, they totally think the Yankees are awful. Clearly, right? Let's move on, right? And Reconstruction was bad. You don't have to think, because everything else is just, center in the film. So I think it really builds off of let's push the direct politics and the history to the background a bit, right? Enough that it is just understood. Let's take away some of the worst parts of Mitchell's novel. And, we'll just kind of use euphemisms around it. And by that time, people still fairly probably believe some of the same things about the war and Reconstruction, but it doesn't have to be as explicitly said, I think, as it does. We don't see the scenes of the Klan, et cetera.
Yeah, the same kind of thing. It's a lot harder to argue against a film about what's not in it, right? All films are selective, all historical films are selective. And so when films have really, troublesome imagery in them, to say, oh, well, look, you did this, you did that. But when it's just, as Ashley says, when you just put it in the background, it's a lot harder to be like, well, they didn't do this and they didn't do that. Oh, well, it's just a movie. Oh, well, but look, the costumes and the sweeping vistas, and it's really about something else, right? It makes it a lot harder thing to argue against. But that film also, because it's well made, because it's it's a good example of what it is, and well crafted. it's done as much as any other one, probably more than any other one, for that kind of romanticized image of the antebellum South, right? For the way that people can sort of romanticize that, and sort of go visit, sort of think that they're, I guess that, say, like a plantation house is a nice place to have your wedding, or that kind of thing. And the kind of debates that people get into that, they're sort of amazed that other people don't think those plantation houses are a nice romantic place to have a wedding. That kind of thing. But that's partly based on that imagery, and that's where that comes from, is places like Gone with the Wind, because that part of it got erased, and that imagery is so deeply embedded that primarily it was about the dresses and the magnolia trees and the fainting couch or whatever, right? And that's really, really powerful, just by omitting all the other stuff that was the real history of those places.
So what you're saying is next time we should just try to watch Gone with the Wind and discuss that one. So my final question for all of you: why is this film important? Or is this film still important? Should it continue to be taught in schools and universities? And if so, how? Why don't we start with Ashleigh, then Paul, then Rob?
Yes, it is still a very important film. Still should be continuing to be taught. I teach about it in nearly all the classes. I teach African American history, post 1865. I teach U.S. history post 1865. I teach a class on Civil War memory as a seminar occasionally, where I also, show portions of the film. Most of my students have never seen parts of it or have only seen certain clips from it. So I try to contextualize the moment in which this film emerges, because I teach about the second iteration of the KKK and how this film plays a role in it. I talk about Colorado being a place where we had a huge KKK population, and, how, this film and its popularity plays into it. I think it has to be taught. One, because, understanding how film as a media, how this is important in the history of film, and why film becomes such an important part of, our sort of popular culture history as a tool of many things: popular culture, propaganda, all of these things. And I think students really appreciate, knowing how differently film was viewed then compared to now, how, things have changed technically, but also narrative style. But why this film had such a broad popular appeal, and contextualizing it within the history of the United States and what was going on, for all the things we just said earlier, but why African Americans had huge problems with it. But why it also represented a huge part of what many white Americans, North, South, and wherever, viewed about the war, about Reconstruction, about Black Americans at the time, and why having an avenue to spread these kinds of ideas was particularly dangerous and concerning for African Americans. So I think absolutely it's still something that should be taught. I think people have done a really good job in recent years, of learning, how to properly contextualize it, how to properly teach these kinds of films, and to have students, understand the history of film. I've had students watch, they've seen the clips of the character, the woman being chased and then jumping off the cliff. They think it's comically racist, is what my students all often say. And I said, yeah, it seems really over the top. It's a silent film. A lot of things seem really expressive and over the top, but you also understand that people were watching this in earnest in 1915 and thinking, oh, it's awful, this crazy Black man. I was like, they would have viewed it very differently. They come from a very different mindset that you guys come from, right? I think absolutely we need to see how we've transitioned into other forms, how, getting from a Birth of a Nation to a Gone with the Wind, how do we get to these different stories of telling these sort of narratives around the war? It's been really important for me, for teaching about, the history of racism, the history of white supremacy, the history of propaganda, the history of, racist histories. So I will continue to teach it.
Yeah, me too. I've taught it a lot, and I'm teaching, either usually film history or introduction to film or those kinds of things. And so I want, it's important in those histories because it has such a place in film history, but also because I do want my students to sort of understand that history of racism in film and the sort of power those images have, all the things we've been talking about here in the last hour. With this sort of and I guess they can also see, I think, even in an intro class, I sometimes just show the second half. It's kind of impractical sometimes to show the full film. And I think they can see, as much as it's very different in the way that Ashleigh is talking about, it can seem comical, or, it's hard to watch silent film. They've never seen one before. They can still see how it kind of works like a Hollywood film enough that they can sort of get the sense that how this would work on people, right? It's not so foreign enough that they kind of, it sort of scares them a little, right? In the sense that they can see how this could work on people. And so that's a kind of a good lesson. The one sort of caveat, I think, is that, I teach in a kind of a sort of stereotypical Northeastern liberal arts college full of mostly liberal students. And so part of the reason for teaching this then is to, and this is less true in recent years, but over the years was partly to sort of puncture their kind of like liberal bubbles a little bit, to sort of make them see a little more sort of the troublesome aspects of American history. That's a little less true in the last 4 or 5 years because of COVID and because of the state of American politics. Their bubble needs a little less puncturing than it did 5 years ago. So I try to acknowledge that, but it's also this is like a lot of institutions. It's a predominantly white institution. I'm also really careful about showing this to Black students, especially since I'm white. That what am I inflicting on them, and thinking about their discomfort in watching this, especially if sometimes I only have one Black student in a class full of white students to watch this, to talk about it. And so I really try to be sort of careful and nuanced and try to sort of read the room. There's no right answer to that, no set formula I've been able to figure out that it like makes it work every time. I just try to be aware of who I am and who they are, and try to sort of work around that, and try to be really sort of careful around it. But I do believe in teaching it, but it's always I try to not have a sort of formula, because the students who sit in front of me are different all the time.
I'll add that I do teach the film. When I teach the second half of the U.S. history survey, I don't think students can understand, right, the kind of birth of modern cinema, birth of kind of the modern feature film, but also this kind of mass culture, mass society, mass immigration, and the backlash without the film, right? But also the teaching of a kind of silent film from 100 years ago. They've already kind of struggled to watch a modern feature film, right? And everything has to be kind of made for a TikTok kind of Tubi generation, right? But understanding the cadence of the film and kind of, I think, as helpful as kind of the passage of different country. But I'm also increasingly trying to think about, how do you teach the backlash, or how do you teach the kind of African-American response to the film? And there's a kind of an easy way to do that, where you kind of talk about NAACP and you talk about William Monroe Trotter. And I think that's important. The students need to understand that history. But increasingly, I try to pair this film with Oscar Michaud's Within Our Gates, and think about kind of the African-American cinematic response here, right? I think kind of, I come to kind of history at the moment where African-American intellectual history was kind of at its kind of ferment, and the kind of thinking about kind of how can we think about and teach African-American history different? How can we kind of think about kind of African-American intellectual problems, responses to things like white supremacy, responses to kind of African-American, white American intellectual production. And so, right, there's often kind of an asymmetry where you kind of talk about Birth of a Nation, and then you get the kind of march on the grounds. And you need to understand this long Black freedom struggle, but I think it's equally important to understand that kind of African-American leaders, as early as the kind of World War I era, are thinking in their own cinematic cadence, right? They're thinking about kind of, how do you repurpose some of the images and kind of show audiences. Often these are African-American audiences, and often these are kind of films that didn't survive for much of the 20th century and aren't in our kind of circulation until kind of the modern civil rights movement and after. But the kind of thinking about kind of what Oscar Michaud is trying to do in the South Side of Chicago in these film houses for Black audiences, right? Kind of thinking about this is also kind of a modern moment. This is also kind of a modern way of understanding kind of the kind of Jim Crow South. I teach at a Southern university. Most of my classes tend to be white Southerners. Most of my students kind of can probably trace some descendants to the Confederacy, if not actually kind of ancestors and descendants who had kind of robes from the first or the second Ku Klux Klan. So it's a different proposition to teaching that. They know this history in their bones, right? And kind of my Black students know this as well. So kind of repurposing and retracing that. They know kind of the battles, and they kind of have kind of their own kind of positions, whether they say that publicly or not publicly, kind of where they stand. But kind of the the hidden history, the more difficult things, the kind of things that get lost, right? They know Birth of a Nation exists before they walk into the classroom in a place like the University of Tennessee. They don't know Oscar Micheaux. They don't understand, right, the kind of rival and hidden histories, these kind of hidden transcripts of cinema that also were existing at the same time, that are also kind of part of this kind of struggle to kind of find a kind of way to tell an American story.
I show within Our Gates as well, especially because it's such a crucial lesson that within that film, Micheaux is by showing events from multiple perspectives, he's trying to teach his audience that film can't be trusted in a way that Griffith kept insisting his film was absolute historical truth. And so that's a crucial lesson, that Micheaux understood something fundamental about film that Griffith did not, or chose not to, or pretended not to, or whatever it was. And so that lesson, especially in that context, is absolutely crucial. And so it's a sort of a great moment to have in the class, and especially in a film class. You know, you're talking about how people were thinking about film and discovering how film worked, and that thing that Micheaux is understanding and showing to his audience is absolutely crucial for my students.
I think that's a good note to end on. I want to really thank you all. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I think it was really interesting, and I feel like I personally learned a lot. And so thank you all for taking so much time out of your schedules to sit with me and for doing this podcast.
This was great. And I can't wait to read Ashleigh and Robert's books. So please write faster.
Oh, trying.
I mean, aren't we all? Yeah. Well, thanks so much.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.